Did people really die at 30 in the Middle Ages? Was every medieval village a ghost town by age 40? Do you think no one ever saw gray hair during those long centuries? Prepare for some eye-opening facts about life expectancy in the Middle Ages. Number 1. No one lived to old age. Gray hair was a mythical beast. The idea that reaching what we today call old age was an impossible feat for medieval people lingers in many minds. This belief paints a picture of a world where individuals rarely saw their hair turn gray or their skin wrinkle with age. It suggests that medieval society was populated almost entirely by young adults and children, with the elderly being an anomaly, a true rarity. The common image often depicts a person in their late 20s or early 30s as already ancient, their bodies worn out by hard labor and relentless disease. This perception leads to the thought that anyone past 40 was an exception to the rule, a miracle of survival. The notion is that if you lived past the age of 50 in the Middle Ages, you were truly in uncharted territory, a solitary figure among the young. This widespread assumption suggests that a long life, as we define it today, was simply not a part of the human experience during that historical period. Historical records, however, tell a different story, one filled with individuals who navigated the challenges of their time and reached advanced ages. There are numerous documented cases of people living into their 60s, 70s, and even 80s, challenging the simplified narrative of universal premature death. For example, Geoffrey Chaucer, the renowned English poet, is believed to have died in his early 60s, a respectable age even by modern standards. His life, spanning from roughly 1343 to 1400, saw him through significant historical events including the Black Death, yet he endured for decades beyond the supposed average. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, lived to be 82 years old, passing away in 1204. Her long life involved 2 royal marriages, numerous children, political intrigue, and even a crusade. Her journey through life was not cut short by the perceived harshness of the era. She was a prominent figure who lived through a significant portion of the 12th century. Church records and monastic chronicles also provide striking evidence of longevity. Monasteries, with their structured routines, often offered a degree of stability and access to food and basic care that was not always available to the general population. Abbot Suger of Saint Denis, a key advisor to French kings, lived to 70, dying in 1151. His life was one of intense political activity and intellectual pursuit, enduring for 7 decades. A study by historians, such as those published in the Journal of Medieval History, often refer to monastic death registers, which contain entries for monks and nuns who reached ages well beyond the commonly cited 30s or 40s. For instance, some monks at the Abbey of Cluny are recorded as living into their 60s and 70s during the High Middle Ages. A 12th century text from the Abbey of St. Gall mentions a monk who lived to be 80. These were not singular instances, but appear with enough frequency to indicate that living long was a known, if not universal, possibility. Nobility, due to their privileged access to resources, often saw their members live longer than commoners. King Louis IX of France, canonized as Saint Louis, lived to 56, dying during a crusade in 1270. While not extremely old, his age surpasses the common misconception of a 30-year limit. Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, reigned for 35 years and died at the age of 68 in 1307. His life was filled with warfare and political struggles, yet he lived through decades of it. John of Gaunt, son of Edward III of England, lived to be 59, dying in 1399. These figures, through their documented lives, provide concrete examples of medieval individuals who experienced many years. Genealogies of noble families meticulously kept for succession and property rights frequently list individuals who passed their fifth or sixth decade. These family trees illustrate continuous lines of descent through generations that saw multiple family members attain what we would consider a respectable old age. Skeletal remains recovered from medieval cemeteries also offer compelling physical evidence. Bioarchaeologists, through the analysis of bones and teeth, can estimate the age of death. While many skeletons belong to younger individuals, a significant proportion show markers of advanced age, such as severe arthritis, healed fractures, extensive tooth wear, or bone conditions, indicative of old age. These findings from archaeological digs, detailed in works like Bioarchaeology of the Medieval Period by specialists such as Sarah E. King, consistently show that some individuals, even among the poorer classes, lived long enough for their bodies to exhibit the wear and tear of many decades. The bones tell a story of endurance, revealing that people survived childhood diseases, accidents, and feigns to experience long lives. The presence of numerous older skeletons, even if outnumbered by younger ones, confirms that old age was a reality, not a myth. Beyond the stark physical evidence, the concept of old age was recognized and held a specific status in medieval society. Elders were often seen as repositories of wisdom and experience. Legal documents and community structures recognized and accommodated older individuals. Wills and charters frequently mention provisions for elderly parents or relatives, indicating a societal expectation that some people would live long enough to need such care. Guilds and communal organizations sometimes had provisions for their aging members, offering support or a form of retirement. These societal structures would not have developed if living to old age was a truly rare occurrence. The very presence of terms like elder or ancient in medieval texts, referring to individuals of advanced years, shows that such people were not unknown figures. They were an accepted part of the social landscape. The notion of old age also found its way into medieval art and literature. Illuminated manuscripts and sculptures sometimes depict older individuals with gray beards and wrinkled faces, not as fantastical creatures, but as recognizable members of society, often portrayed with dignity and wisdom. Portraits of prominent figures, though stylized, occasionally captured the features of age. For instance, a depiction of a monk in a 14th century manuscript might show signs of age, conveying respect for their long service. The visual record supports the idea that older people were a visible and acknowledged part of the community, not an invisible minority. These artistic representations, while not always realistic in a modern sense, reflect a contemporary understanding and acceptance of aging bodies within the social fabric. In summary, the assumption that no one lived to old age in the Middle Ages is a simplification. While challenging, achieving a long life was within the realm of possibility for many. The historical records, archaeological findings, and cultural context all provide a counter-narrative, showing that gray hair and wisdom gained through decades were indeed a part of the medieval human experience. Number 2. People were constantly sick and diseased, leading to quick demise. A pervasive image of the Middle Ages depicts a time when everyone was perpetually ill, coughing, wheezing, or racked with pain, with death always lurking around the corner from an endless array of diseases. This view suggests that medieval life was a constant struggle against a tide of sickness, making survival past a few short decades an extraordinary feat. It implies that daily existence was characterized by widespread chronic ailments and frequent deadly outbreaks where individuals rarely experienced periods of robust health. This perception often stems from the known devastating impacts of plagues and famines, extending their effects to encompass all of medieval history and every individual. It suggests that medical knowledge was so rudimentary that people had no defense against illness, meaning any sickness quickly escalated into a fatal condition. While disease was indeed a significant challenge in the Middle Ages, and life was certainly not free from health risks, the idea of universal, constant sickness is an overstatement. People experienced periods of health, and the human body's natural resilience was often underestimated in modern portrayals. Many individuals went about their daily lives without being perpetually incapacitated by illness. The focus on large-scale epidemics like the Black Death, which caused massive mortality, sometimes overshadows the fact that these were specific acute events, not the constant state of affairs for centuries. While devastating when they struck, they were not present in every village, every year. Between such outbreaks, communities would recover and life would return to a more stable, albeit still challenging, rhythm. Many common illnesses in the Middle Ages were, as they are today, self-limiting. Colds, minor infections, and digestive upsets were undoubtedly common. However, the majority of people recovered from these without fatal consequences. The human immune system, even without modern medicine, was capable of fighting off numerous pathogens. Children, if they survived the critical early years of infancy and toddlerhood, often developed immunities to common childhood diseases. This process of acquiring immunity while leading to high mortality in early life also meant that those who survived often had a stronger defense against future infections. For instance, measles or mumps outbreaks could be deadly, but individuals who recovered would not contract them again. The perception of constant sickness also overlooks regional and temporal variations. Health conditions varied greatly depending on location, social status, and the specific historical period. Rural areas, for example, often had cleaner air and less dense populations than burgeoning towns and cities. This could lead to a lower incidence of some contagious diseases. While urban centers were certainly hotbeds for disease due to poor sanitation and close quarters, even within cities, some districts might have fared better than others. Studies of medieval urban health, such as those by Carole Rawcliffe in Medicine and Society in later medieval England, detailed the localized nature of some disease outbreaks and the attempts by city authorities to manage public health, however limited those efforts might have been. Diet played a crucial role in health, and while varied for different social classes, it was often more nutritious than sometimes portrayed. A peasant's diet, though sometimes meager, often included whole grains, legumes, and seasonal vegetables providing essential nutrients. For example, a diet rich in oats, barley, and peas could offer significant sustenance. Access to protein, while less consistent for the poor, was available through dairy eggs and occasionally meat or fish. A balanced diet, even if basic, supported immune function. Famines, which certainly caused widespread suffering and increased susceptibility to disease, were periods of acute crisis, not the everyday reality for the entire medieval period. There were many years of good harvests and relative food security. Medieval medical practices, though different from modern ones, were not entirely without merit in managing symptoms and providing care. Herbal remedies, based on centuries of empirical observation, offered relief for various ailments, from fevers to pain. For instance, willow bark was used to reduce pain and fever, a practice that anticipates modern aspirin. Monasteries and even local wise women often held significant knowledge of medicinal plants. Surgeons, while often operating without anesthesia or antiseptics, performed procedures like setting broken bones, lancing boils, and even basic amputations, which allowed many to survive injuries that might otherwise have become fatal through infection. Evidence of healed bones in skeletal remains frequently attests to successful treatment and recovery from serious trauma. Hygiene, though not understood in the modern germ theory sense, was practiced in various forms. People washed themselves, their clothes, and sometimes their homes. While public sanitation was poor in many areas, individual efforts to maintain cleanliness were present. Bathing, though not a daily ritual for most, was not unheard of. Public bathhouses existed in some towns, and private bathing was common for the wealthy. Religious practices often encouraged cleanliness before certain rites. The idea that medieval people never washed is a gross exaggeration. These practices, however rudimentary, played some role in preventing the spread of disease. The perception of constant sickness also neglects the sheer physical resilience of medieval people. Their lives often involved significant physical labor, which, while demanding, also built strong bodies. Daily activities like farming, building, and crafting required strength and stamina. This physical conditioning could contribute to overall health and recovery from illness. Archaeological studies on skeletal remains often reveal robust bone structures and muscle attachments, indicating strong, active individuals who were not constantly wasting away from disease. In conclusion, while disease was a constant threat and a significant factor in medieval life, the notion that people were constantly sick and quickly succumbed to every ailment is an oversimplification. Medieval people experienced periods of health. Their bodies possessed natural resilience, and they employed various, albeit limited, methods to cope with and recover from illness. The reality was far more nuanced than a picture of universal, unending suffering. Number 3. Death was always imminent and expected at any age, so people did not plan for old age. A common belief about the Middle Ages is that people lived with an overwhelming sense of immediate mortality, expecting death to strike at any moment, regardless of their age. This perspective suggests that the pervasive threat of disease, famine, and violence created a mindset where planning for a distant future, especially old age, was considered futile and perhaps even foolish. It implies that medieval individuals, given their short life expectancies, did not bother with long-term financial arrangements, familial support structures, or societal provisions for the elderly. The assumption is that if you might die in your 20s or 30s, there was no point in thinking about what would happen when you were 60 or 70. This belief often leads to the idea that people just lived day to day, without looking ahead to the future. However, historical records clearly demonstrate that medieval people, particularly those with property or status, regularly engaged in long-term planning, including provisions for their potential old age. The existence of extensive legal documents such as wills, charters, and marriage contracts provides undeniable evidence of a future-oriented mindset. Individuals meticulously outlined the distribution of their assets, the care of their dependents, and often specific arrangements for their own support if they became infirm or elderly. These documents reveal a society that recognized and prepared for the possibility of a long life. For example, a will might specify that a certain parcel of land or a portion of income be set aside for the upkeep of a spouse or parent should they outlive the willmaker. Such detailed planning indicates a clear expectation that people would indeed live to older ages. Inheritance practices were deeply ingrained in medieval society, further proving that people looked beyond their immediate lifespan. Land, titles, and property were passed down through generations, often requiring complex legal agreements to ensure a smooth transition. These agreements frequently involved provisions for the current generation to support the previous one in their old age. A common arrangement was for a retiring farmer to transfer land to his son in exchange for food, lodging, and care until his death. These types of retirement contracts are documented in numerous manorial records and legal archives across Europe. Historians like Barbara Hannawalt, who studied English peasant life, have extensively documented these intergenerational agreements, showing them to be common features of medieval rural society. Such contracts would be meaningless if old age was an unheard of phenomenon. Families were the primary social safety net, and this included care for the elderly. Multi-generational households were a common feature, especially in rural areas. Older parents or grandparents often continued to live with their adult children, contributing to the household where they could, or being cared for if their health declined. This familial support system was not just a spontaneous act, but an expected social norm. The absence of state-sponsored pensions or widespread institutional care meant that the family unit bore the responsibility for its aging members. The willingness and capacity of families to undertake this care imply that old people were a regular presence within their communities. Beyond the family, some institutions provided support for the elderly. Almshouses, often founded by wealthy benefactors, religious orders, or guilds, existed to provide shelter and sustenance for the poor and aged. While not universal, their existence demonstrates a societal awareness and attempt to address the needs of older individuals who might not have familial support. For instance, St. Cross Hospital in Winchester, founded in the 12th century, provided continuous care for a certain number of elderly men, indicating a long-standing tradition of such provisions. Guilds also sometimes offered pensions or support to their aging members, or their widows, showing a collective responsibility for their older cohorts. These provisions were not merely for those facing immediate death, but for those who had lived long lives and could no longer work. Skeletal evidence from archaeological digs also supports the idea that people survived injuries and illnesses, leading to long lives. Many medieval skeletons show evidence of healed fractures, sometimes multiple times over, or signs of chronic conditions like arthritis that develop over decades. The presence of such healed injuries indicates that individuals survived these traumas and continued to live for a significant period afterward. For example, a skeleton might show a broken leg that fused improperly but healed, indicating that the person lived long enough for the bone to mend, even if it left a permanent limp. This physical evidence directly counters the idea that any significant injury meant immediate death. These bodies tell a story of resilience and survival across many years. Furthermore, medieval legal systems and societal norms often placed a high value on age and experience. Elders were often consulted for their wisdom in community affairs, land disputes, and moral guidance. The concept of venerable elders in religious and secular texts was common, denoting respect for those who had lived long and gained wisdom. This social recognition of older individuals would not have developed if they were so rare as to be almost mythological. The very fabric of legal inheritance and the social hierarchy often depended on the continuity of generations, with specific roles and rights accorded to older family members. In conclusion, the assumption that medieval people did not plan for old age because of the constant threat of imminent death is not supported by historical evidence. Medieval society, through its legal structures, family dynamics, and institutional provisions, clearly recognized the possibility and often the reality of individuals living to old age and made deliberate efforts to plan for it. Their planning reflected a future-oriented outlook, not a mere day-to-day existence. Number 4. People did not know how to live long and had no health practices. A widespread misconception suggests that medieval people were entirely ignorant of health, hygiene, and the basic principles of promoting a long life. This view often paints a picture of a populace utterly without any knowledge of well-being, passively submitting to illness and early death due to a complete lack of medical understanding or preventive practices. It implies that medieval society operated in a vacuum of health consciousness, unable to recognize the connection between certain behaviors and positive health outcomes. This belief stems from comparing medieval medicine to modern scientific understanding, often dismissing all earlier practices as useless or even harmful, and assumes a complete absence of any attempt to manage health. However, medieval people were far from ignorant when it came to maintaining health, and attempting to prolong life, even if their understanding of disease causes differed from modern science. They developed and practiced various health regimes, dietary principles, and hygiene customs, based on centuries of observation and inherited wisdom. Their medical systems, primarily based on humoral theory, provided a framework for understanding the body and its ailments, and while this theory is now discredited, it guided practices aimed at restoring balance and promoting health. For example, medieval physicians believed that maintaining a balance of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was crucial for health. They prescribed specific diets, exercise, and bathing regimens to achieve this balance. Dietary advice was a central component of medieval health practices. Treatises on food and drink were common, outlining which foods were considered hot, cold, wet, or dry, and how they affected the humors. Physicians recommended specific foods for different temperaments, seasons, and illnesses. They emphasized moderation in eating and drinking, and recognized the importance of fresh produce, even if the concept of vitamins was unknown. For instance, a physician might advise consuming lighter, cooler foods in summer to prevent an excess of yellow bile. This was not a haphazard approach, but a systematic attempt to influence health through diet. The emphasis on balanced nutrition, even through the lens of humoral theory, contributed to overall well-being. Hygiene, while different from modern standards, was a recognized part of medieval life. People did wash themselves and their clothes, although the frequency and methods varied. Public bathhouses were present in many towns and cities across Europe, particularly in the earlier medieval period and in areas influenced by Roman or Islamic traditions. While some bathhouses later declined in popularity due to concerns about disease spread or moral objections, personal washing with water and soap, often made from animal fats and lye, was common. Monasteries often had sophisticated water systems and practices for cleanliness. For example, many monastic rules included provisions for regular washing of hands and feet, personal grooming, and the cleaning of living spaces, even if basic, were part of daily routines. Exercise and physical activity were also implicitly understood as beneficial for health. The vast majority of the population engaged in regular physical labor which, while sometimes strenuous, contributed to physical fitness and stamina. Beyond work activities, like hunting, riding, and various sports, such as wrestling or early forms of football, were common. Physicians advised specific types of exercise for different body types and conditions, believing it helped to circulate the humors and expel waste. A physician might recommend walking for a melancholic patient to improve their disposition and physical health. Herbal medicine was a cornerstone of medieval health care. Knowledge of medicinal plants was extensive and passed down through generations, often recorded in herbals and medical texts. People used a wide array of herbs for pain, relief, fever reduction, digestive issues, and wound healing. For instance, comfrey was used for broken bones and chamomile for calming. Monasteries cultivated herb gardens for medicinal purposes, and local wise women or healers often had significant practical knowledge of remedies. While the mechanisms were unknown, many of these plants contained active compounds that provided genuine therapeutic effects. This accumulated botanical knowledge was a vital part of health management. Public health efforts, though rudimentary by modern standards, were not entirely absent. Some medieval cities attempted to manage waste, regulate food sales, and control the spread of disease. City ordinances sometimes addressed issues like keeping pigs out of streets, prohibiting the dumping of refuse, and regulating the quality of bread and meat sold in markets. While these efforts were often insufficient to prevent major epidemics, they represent an awareness of public well-being. For example, London had regulations concerning the cleaning of streets and the removal of waste from the Thames. These measures, however imperfect, were attempts to improve the general health environment. Even childbirth, a perilous event for women, was managed with some practices aimed at increasing survival. Midwives, typically experienced older women, attended births, offering comfort, guidance, and sometimes traditional remedies. While maternal mortality was high, the existence of a specialized profession dedicated to assisting birth shows a societal effort to mitigate its dangers. Women were not left to fend for themselves entirely during this critical life event. In summary, the notion that medieval people had no health practices or knowledge is a gross misrepresentation. They possessed a complex system of beliefs about health and illness, developed various methods for promoting well-being, engaged in dietary and hygiene practices, and utilized a vast knowledge of herbal remedies. Their approach to health, while different from ours, was a deliberate and often effective attempt to live long and healthy lives within their understanding of the world. Number 5. Life was uniformly short for everyone, regardless of their station. A common misconception about the Middle Ages is that everyone from the lowest peasant to the highest king shared the same grim fate of a uniformly short life. This view suggests that the harsh realities of medieval existence, disease, famine, and violence equally affected all social strata, making wealth, power, or privilege irrelevant in the face of widespread mortality. It implies that a lord or a king was just as likely to die young as a serf, leading to a general leveling of life expectancy across the entire social hierarchy. This idea often ignores the profound differences in daily life experiences that existed between different groups in medieval society. However, historical and archaeological evidence strongly indicates that social class, wealth, and occupation played a significant role in determining an individual's life expectancy during the Middle Ages. Life was not uniformly short for everyone. Those at the top of the social hierarchy often enjoyed advantages that significantly increased their chances of living longer compared to the vast majority of the population. These advantages included better nutrition, more hygienic living conditions, less strenuous physical labor, and greater access to what passed for medical care at the time. Nobility and royalty, for instance, generally had access to a more varied and abundant diet. Their tables were supplied with a wider array of meats, fish, fresh produce when available, and fine grains, ensuring a more consistent intake of essential nutrients. This superior nutrition provided a stronger immune system and greater resilience against disease and famine. While a peasant might face starvation during a bad harvest, a lord would typically have reserves stored in his castle or access to distant markets. The regular consumption of protein and a more varied diet could stave off malnutrition. A major contributor to early death among the poor living conditions also differed dramatically. A noble family resided in a stone castle or manor house, often with multiple rooms, a degree of protection from the elements and larger, less crowded spaces. While castles were not germ-free environments, they generally offered more protection from the spread of contagion than a crowded peasant hovel. Feudal lords lived in structures designed for defense, providing a measure of security from external threats and better internal environmental controls. Peasants, on the other hand, often lived in small single-room dwellings, shared with their families and sometimes livestock, leading to poorer ventilation, greater exposure to animal waste, and a higher risk of disease transmission. The nature of work was another crucial factor. The life of a peasant was one of unrelenting physical labor, from dawn till dusk, often under harsh weather conditions. Tilling fields, harvesting crops, and tending livestock were physically demanding and exposed them to injuries, chronic pain, and early onset of degenerative conditions. In contrast, nobles, while they might engage in hunting or warfare, typically did not perform the same kind of back-breaking, repetitive manual labor. Their occupations were more focused on administration, governance, and military command. This difference in physical exertion could contribute to longer lives for the elite, as their bodies were not subjected to the same level of constant strain and wear. Access to medical care, however rudimentary, was also a privilege of the wealthy. While medieval medicine was not scientifically advanced, wealthy individuals could afford the services of physicians, barber, surgeons, and apothecaries. These practitioners, though limited in their understanding, could provide basic care, administer herbal remedies, and perform some surgical procedures. For example, a lord might have a physician constantly in his retinue, ready to treat any ailment. A peasant, in contrast, often relied on folk remedies, the limited knowledge of local healers, or simply endured their illness. While these services were not foolproof, they offered a better chance of survival for the sick and injured among the elite. Historical records provide numerous examples illustrating this disparity. As mentioned previously, figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine, 82, Edward I, 68, and Geoffrey Chaucer, 60s, lived to advanced ages, all members of the aristocracy or wealthy professional class. While not every noble lived to such an age, the proportion of those who did was higher than among commoners. Studies by demographers and historians, such as those published in Past and Present or Economic History Review, drawing on manorial records, probate wills, and genealogical studies, consistently show a noticeable difference in life expectancy between the aristocracy and the peasantry. For instance, data from medieval English peerage shows that noblemen had a significantly higher chance of living beyond 50 compared to the general male population. Even within the peasantry, variations existed. A master craftsman in a town with a more stable income and better living conditions than a landless laborer might have a better chance of survival. Monastics, while taking vows of poverty, often lived in relatively stable and ordered environments with access to regular food and some form of infirmary care. As noted in research on monastic life, monks and nuns often lived longer than the average layperson, demonstrating the impact of a more structured and perhaps healthier lifestyle. In conclusion, the idea that life was uniformly short for everyone in the Middle Ages is an oversimplification. Social class, wealth, and occupation significantly influenced an individual's chances of survival and longevity. The elite, with their access to better food, living conditions, and care, had a distinct advantage, leading to a noticeable difference in life expectancies across the social hierarchy. Number 6. Everyone died young, around 30 or 35 years old. The most persistent and widely held misconception about medieval life expectancy is the belief that everyone, without exception, died incredibly young, often stated as being around 30 or 35 years old. This idea paints a bleak picture of a fleeting existence, where people were already considered ancient by the time they reached what we now consider early adulthood. It implies that seeing gray hair or celebrating a 40th birthday was an almost unheard of event, reserved only for a rare few. This oversimplified statistic has become deeply ingrained in popular culture, influencing how many people perceive the entire medieval period as a time of universally brief lives. This pervasive notion largely stems from a misinterpretation of historical demographic data, specifically the concept of average life expectancy at birth. When historians and demographers calculate the average life expectancy at birth for medieval populations, the number indeed appears very low, often hovering around 25 to 35 years. However, this average is heavily skewed by the extraordinarily high rates of infant and child mortality. A massive proportion of medieval children did not survive their first year of life, and many more died before reaching the age of 5. These early deaths drastically pull down the overall average for the entire population. For instance, if half of all children died before age 5 and the other half lived to age 60, the average life expectancy at birth for that group would be 30. This mathematical reality does not mean that no one lived past 5, or that all survivors only made it to 30. Instead, it means that for those who successfully navigated the perilous early years of childhood, the chances of living a much longer life significantly increased. Historians, such as Robert Fossier in his work on medieval demography, consistently point out that surviving childhood was the biggest hurdle. Once a person made it past the vulnerable first few years and through adolescence, their prospects for a longer life improved considerably. If a medieval person reached their early 20s having survived the childhood diseases, famines, and accidents that claimed so many others, their remaining life expectancy could easily extend into their 40s, 50s, or even 60s. This is often referred to as conditional life expectancy, how long you could expect to live if you survived to a certain age. Studies on medieval populations show that an individual who reached the age of 20 might then expect to live another 20 to 30 years, putting their total lifespan into the 40s or 50s. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries supports this nuanced view. While burial sites often contain a high proportion of infant and child skeletons, they also contain numerous adult skeletons, many of which show signs of having lived to middle or old age. Bioarchaeological analyses of bones and teeth can estimate age at death, and these studies reveal that while many people died young, a significant number lived into their 40s, 50s, and beyond. For example, analysis of skeletal remains from medieval sites in England often show individuals with worn teeth, arthritis, and other age-related conditions, indicating lives that extended well past the common 30-year misconception. Historical records further corroborate this reality. While comprehensive birth and death records were not kept in the modern sense, piecemeal evidence from wills, charters, tax rolls, court documents, and monastic records frequently mentions individuals living well beyond their 30s. As previously discussed, figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine lived into her 80s, and many kings, queens, nobles, and high-ranking clergy lived into their 50s, 60s, and even 70s. Even among the peasantry, while less frequently documented, individuals known to have lived to older ages appear in manorial records when they transferred land or made provisions for their retirement. The high mortality rates were primarily due to factors like infectious diseases, which disproportionately affected children, poor sanitation, lack of understanding of germ theory, frequent famines, and the dangers of childbirth for women. These factors created a hazardous environment, especially for the young. However, they did not mean that everyone who survived these challenges was then universally doomed to die in their early 30s. The human body is remarkably resilient, and many individuals were able to navigate these perils. The persistent image of universal young death also ignores the social fabric of medieval society, which clearly recognized and accommodated older individuals. The concept of elders, their wisdom, and their role in the family and community would not have developed if no one ever reached old age. Wills made provisions for elderly parents, and retirement agreements for laborers or landholders were common, demonstrating a societal expectation that people would indeed live long enough to cease active work. These social structures simply would not exist if everyone died by 35. In conclusion, the idea that everyone in the Middle Ages died young, around 30 or 35, is a misleading generalization. While life expectancy at birth was indeed low due to high infant and child mortality, those who survived the perilous early years had a much greater chance of living into middle and old age. Historical records, archaeological findings, and the very structure of medieval society contradict the notion of universal premature death, revealing a more complex and varied reality of lifespans.